In this video, we're going to look at errors that you can make when you're doing hypothesis testing in statistics. The first kind of error is called a type 1 error. Type 1 means your conclusion was to reject the null hypothesis. But the error is that you shouldn't have done that. Your test statistic told you that you should, but it turns out that the null hypothesis claim is actually true. So whatever claim was made in the null hypothesis is a true value, but your sample resulted in a decision to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so your sample indicates that you should reject the null hypothesis, but for whatever reason, your sample result wasn't accurate. So maybe you didn't take a good sample, or perhaps your sample was an extreme sample. Maybe you just happened to get all of one kind of result in your sample. If you were measuring heights, for example, if your sample just happened to be a whole bunch of short people, you might get a sample to indicate something that's actually not true about the population. The probability of making a type 1 error is alpha. So whatever you choose for alpha as your cutoff percentage to compare to your p-value, that is the chance that you're going to reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is actually true. So the smaller alpha you choose, the less likely you are to make a type 1 error. So depending on what kind of study you're doing, you may want to choose the smallest alpha possible. And say you're doing clinical trials for a drug, you want to be absolutely sure that that drug is effective. You want to choose the smallest alpha possible to make sure you're not making a type 1 error. The type 2 error is to fail to reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis claim is actually false. So your sample should result in rejecting the null hypothesis, but again, for whatever reason, your sample doesn't work out right. So your sample indicates fail to reject, but that's incorrect. Again, for whatever reason. The symbol for the probability for type 2 error is beta. At this point in time, we're not going to worry about what that number actually is. We'll just know that that type of error exists. So a couple examples. These might be a little bit different wording than what is on your notes sheet. Let's move this up. So I'm just going to, and you can adjust your notes if you need to. I'm going to use it the way that it is on this sheet. So we'll say that there's a claim that 42%, and actually let's not make this a claim. Let's make this, oh yeah, let's leave this as the claim. And then the actual percentage, we'll say this is from your sample. So you took a sample, and your sample percent is 30%, but the claim from the null hypothesis is 42%. So if you had done this test and made a type 1 error, you would reject the null hypothesis. So your sample percentage of 30% appears to be quite different from the 42% for the claim. So it's possible that your test statistic would indicate to reject the null hypothesis, but it's actually true. So if we put this in the context of the problem, you would say that your sample of 30% indicates that the claim of 42% is false, but it turns out that the 42% is actually true. So that would be a type 1 error in that case. A type 2 error is when you fail to reject the null hypothesis, but it's actually false. So putting that in the terms of the problem, let's say that your 30% that you got from your sample is not statistically different from 42% when you had done the test. So your sample would indicate that 30% is not significantly different from the 42%. So the 42% claim would be supported by your evidence. But with further study, or if someone else were to do a study, it turns out that the 42% is not correct. So again, putting it back into the context of the problem. So type 1 error, you've rejected the null hypothesis, but it's actually true. Type 2, you failed to reject the null hypothesis, but it's actually false. Okay, the second one, again, I'm just going to change this a little bit. We'll leave the first one as a claim. That will be from our null hypothesis, but let's change actual to what you get from your sample. So type 1 error, again, you've rejected the null hypothesis when it's true. So in the context of the problem, you would say your sample of greater than 20% is significantly different from claim of less than 20%. Oops. But the actual value is less than 20%. Okay, so you've rejected the null hypothesis because your sample gave you the indication that it was false, but it turns out that it's actually true. And a type 2 error is to fail to reject when it's false. So here your sample percent is not significantly different from the claimed percent. So you would fail to reject the null hypothesis, but it would turn out later the actual value is greater than 20%. So the null hypothesis is actually false. So those are two examples. It takes a little practice to get the hang of writing these, so do some practice problems, and we can do more in class as well for examples.